episode of the Swarm Chatter podcast. I'm Nachi Weinstein. Programming note, there will be a small talk episode later this week. I've been asked about it, so I just want to reiterate that it's sporadic at this point. I'll just be releasing them here and there. There's no set schedule. It won't be every week. Also, as relates to this episode, there'll be links in the show's notes to the Pri Ets Haim database through Dicta, and as you'll hear about on the episode, how they're using AI and technology to digitize all these shuvas and to summaries and synopsises and all that. So you'll find out and you'll hear more about this project. They're pretty fascinating, and about these shuvas in the episode. If anyone would like to sponsor an episode of the podcast or to support the podcast, please email me sfarmchatter@gmail.com or see the information and the links in the show's notes below. If you can also subscribe to the Sfarm Chatter WhatsApp community where I post new books, new Sfarim, and book deals, there's a link in the show's notes below. And if you can please subscribe and rate and review the podcast wherever it is that you listen, Apple, Spotify, 24/6, and so on. And also stay tuned in the coming weeks. In months, there'll be some mini-series forthcoming. I did mention them on the chat. I want to mention them here. There's going to be a 5-part mini-series on the Zohar, the reception of the Zohar, so stay tuned for that. There's also going to be a planned mini-series on the Baal Shem Tov, and there will be some others coming up. If anyone has other ideas, you can let me know. And if anyone has any ideas for Purim or Pesach episodes, it's never too early to get started preparing for that, or a Tu B'Shvat one as well, for that matter. So if anyone has any ideas or guest suggestions, topics, please email me farmchatter@gmail.com. If you're on the chat, you can message me privately. Now, and with that, enjoy the episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Swarm Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Professor Daniel Francis, who is a professor of industrial engineering at the University of Toronto, and by Dr. Josh Guedalia, who works at Dicta, who will get into what they do exactly with technology and AI and different things related to Sfarim and things like that. And this episode of the podcast, we're discussing the Yeshiva Ets Haim in Amsterdam, as well, and mainly focused on their publication that they published for many decades called Pri Ets Haim. This was a journal, one of the earliest real journals, and that ran continuously. Very unique and probably pretty unknown publication to many listeners of this podcast. So thank you, Professor Francis and Dr. Guedalia, for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, let's start off. Tell the listeners a bit about your background. Professor Francis, we can start with you, and then we'll go to Dr. Guedalia.
Yeah, so to start with, I am a professor in engineering and not of history, but I did fall into this. So let me just give you a little bit about my background, which allowed me to get involved in this and got me interested into it. My parents, my father and his father, were born in Salonika, and they moved to Holland in 1928. While the way he got to Amsterdam is that they were looking for rabbis. They usually hired locally. By law, they had to hire locally, but they got an exemption from the government to allow them to hire my grandfather, so he went there. And my father once showed me a tshuva from his father. He didn't quite know much about it, and I'll come back to that later. Now, because I was born in Holland, no Dutch, we then moved to Venezuela, so I learned Spanish, which came in handy because Portuguese and Spanish are similar, so I'm able to understand some of that stuff. And then went to yeshiva here, so I know a little bit, to be able to look at the tshuvas. Spent a year in Israel, so I learned some Hebrew. At that time, there weren't too many English speakers, so I was forced to learn Hebrew in that year, to the extent I do. And then I have some quantitative background, so I had an interest. So that's my background.
Great. Yeah. So my background, I guess, is also pretty eclectic, especially on the topic we're dealing with. So I've got just as an academic background, I've got a BSc in computer science and a master's in business. And recently I did a PhD in bioinformatics, all of which is completely not related to the topic at hand, though the technology background is useful. And just for the sake of what we're focusing on here, my family, my ancestors also have a relationship to the publication of Hebrew books, and also in Salonika. But in 1504, my ancestor Judah Guedalia brought the first printing press to Salonika. And so through the tradition, I feel like we're continuing that tradition of working in the publishing of Hebrew Sfarim, but now in the modern digital age.
Now, Yeah, sorry to jump in. I just want to ask you if we continue. I didn't realize you weren't done, but I also want to ask you, I don't know if you're getting to this, do you have a personal connection to the Pri Ets Haim and to Amsterdam and to the Amsterdam community?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I'm a Spanish and Portuguese Jew, and so we've got quite a roots in Amsterdam and other parts. We trace our family back to Spain, Portugal, Salonika, Livorno, Gibraltar, and then America. That's sort of the traditional path that we took to get Spanish Portuguese Jew, the Guedalia family. And from a number of different angles, I feel actually quite associated with the Pri Ets Haim and the history. I've got family in Amsterdam from my mother's side, and I also my personal history of the involvement in the printing press. So Judah Guedalia, as I mentioned, was in the printing press in Salonika. One of the nice traditions in the Sephardi family is you keep the names in the families, you see them repeat. So I've got a great-grandfather who was Judah Guedalia, I have a grandfather who's Judah Guedalia, and I named my son Judah Guedalia. So we're keeping that tradition alive. And the Spanish Portuguese also was very close to my family's heart. My father was a rabbi in the Spanish Portuguese, and my cousin is now actually the sexton, the shamash in the Spanish Portuguese synagogue. He's actually the one that got me onto the idea of the Pri Ets Haim, the books. I had not known about them, and he suggested that I get involved with the work that I'm doing at Dicta. So I'll just give a sentence about Dicta. Dicta is a organization, and our goal is to make a Hebrew text accessible to the world as much as possible, as well as to use AI and computational science to analyze Hebrew texts and provide and give access to information that's available within the Hebrew text. So we'll talk more about that as we go on.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll try to discuss a little bit about Dicta at the end, although this episode is not about Dicta. Dicta is very relevant because Dicta is involved, and your job is involved. What you're working on here is with the Pri Ets Haim, and what you've done in digitization is very cool. And I think listeners will just even besides the Pri Ets Haim, just to learn about that and the possibilities that will allow for Sfarim going forward. Okay, so back to you, Professor Francis, and I'll try to address each one of you so the listener can know who's speaking, and that we can do this in a structured way. So, where did your interest begin in the Pri Ets Haim that you decided to go into this project? And we'll get into what we did, and again, we'll discuss more about it in a minute. I mean, it's like I said, it's a journal that was for many decades put out by the yeshiva. But how did you get connected to this project?
Yeah, so around 2010, I attended a conference in Oslo in my field, and my trip took me through Amsterdam. And I decided that I should talk to someone. I think I even prepared in advance of my visit, make an appointment with someone at the library. And there's a library adjacent, Montesino Library, has its own history. I could go off in that direction, but make an appointment with someone. And I made an appointment with the librarian who had just joined. And I asked him what my grandfather was a learned man, and he came here to Amsterdam in 1928. I don't see the environment of a yeshiva here. I don't see anything. What was here that would have supported his life as a Talmid Chacham? And he says, I can't really answer that. But he says the previous librarian has been here longer and is around. He doesn't want to talk to tourists and so on, but maybe you can grab him anyway. I grabbed him for 10 minutes he gave me. And he pointed me to a set of Sforim that was right behind us, and a set of 13 volumes, actually less than that, but of Tshuvas. I said, what? What's going on? Yeah, this place has a long tradition of writing Shelot Utshuvot, and they're here. And I was just flabbergasted. And so when I went back came back to Toronto, I asked myself, why did it stop? I looked into it, and it turns out that it stopped in 1808. It started in 1728, went to 1808, and I asked the person I was talking to, by the way, why did it stop? He says, I have no idea. I don't think anybody really knows. So I went back to my school and I said, I have a sabbatical coming up. Do you guys mind if I look into this question? And they said, no, you're fine. As long as if you publish, you put University of Toronto, we're fine. So I went back for 6 months, and I found that the tradition went on beyond the period of the Pri Ets Haim as examinations of people who got smicha in Holland. So there's about 210 shuvas that I found from all the people who graduated back into the early 1800s. And then I found why it stopped, but I won't talk about that here. But that's how I got involved. Now, I tried to publish some of that stuff, and I was told you're not a historian. I did some analysis. And then I had another sabbatical 7 years later, and I said, well, let me look at the Pri Ets Haim itself, because I hadn't looked at that. And again, I have some people that I work with that are editors editors of a journal called Studio Rosa Italiana, which is the only academic journal which covers Jews in the Netherlands. And it's renowned. It's well known. It has a good, it's prestigious. And they told me they couldn't publish based on what I was saying. But if you do some quantitative analysis, which I was starting to do, and it turns out they loved it. I did some various things I can talk about later. And that's how I became involved in really what I know about the Pri Ets Haim is from that second period. Sabbatical. Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned the library now associated with the Ets Haim Yeshiva. Ets Haim was, just in broad strokes, a yeshiva in Amsterdam set up with the Jewish community. I actually have some podcast recording in the Amsterdam community. I don't know if I posted them yet, but so maybe the listeners haven't heard them at this point. But there's a lot more to be done, especially on this podcast, Amsterdam, the community, the Spanish-Portuguese community. It's worth talking about for the listener. I think it's a fascinating community. Not so large anymore today, unfortunately, especially after the Holocaust. And unfortunately, maybe people don't know about them so much. And the yeshiva there, and it has its origins. It goes back to the community. Obviously, there's lots to talk about. The community starts at the former Converso, Spanish, Portuguese, Morano, so to speak. They come from Portugal. They travel there. They end up in Amsterdam, and they eventually start this yeshiva. Just again, very general here. And there's Rosh Leif Mortera is the chief rabbi, and Rabbi Isaac Yitzchavov da Fonseca, and Ashben Israel, and others. And they end up with yeshiva. And this is a very structured institution. What we would know today, really, would recognize as a school or institution. There's different grades. You progress differently than the standard today. But we know about this from the Sifsei Chachamim, Reb Shabsi Moshe Abbas. He speaks about this, and he was very impressed with it, as was the Shlah's son, I believe, Reb Sheftel. And so we do know of Eastern Europeans and others that were passing through and saying, wow, this is really impressive, the way they teach the kids. And this was a very structured. And later on, they would have, these students, the own rabbis would come out of that institution. They would be taught, and they would be kind of go to their own institution, become rabbis. And also the community ends up being involved all over the Americas, the islands. And so in Suriname, Venezuela, and Jamaica, and Curacao, etc., and the Americas. And so they would send out their kind of rabbanim and sheikhim, etc. They would go all London as well, Hamburg, all these different communities. So there's a lot more to go. Very general, just to give a listener a sense of what's going on and what this community is. Very important community, Spanish Portuguese community. So with that, now, Josh, I want to turn back to you. Is that you mentioned kind of your interest and your family connection to Amsterdam, but how did you get involved specifically in the Pri Ets Haim? And again, both of you, this is not your field, so it's interesting. Although you're a dicta, so somewhat, in text. But how did you specifically get involved in this project? And again, it's fascinating. There's 13 volumes of tshuvas. There's a lot of material in there. They have questions, and really, again, I would think most people don't know about it. I should even say, myself, I often say this: the best thing about Jewish history is that it, I think it keeps you humble. You learn new things all the time that you didn't know, and I think the email that I got about this was from Dr. David Sklar, our mutual acquaintance, sent out an email and about this a couple of months ago, and it started to be digitized and Pri Ets Haim, and I know the Kabbalah one. I was like, Pri Ets Haim, what's he talking about? I don't know what he's talking about. And then so I spoke to him, and his friends got in touch with you, and then this is a couple of months later, here we are recording, and so that's kind of what happened. So it's a really interesting project. So Josh, back to you. Where do you get what your involvement is with this project?
Sure. Yeah. So. And just to give it some framework, at Dicta, we're working on digitizing texts. And so that's something I've been working on now for the last year or two. And as part of that, I was really excited to look for texts that haven't yet been digitized. A lot of texts we're doing, they've been done in some other format, but they're not available to the public. So what we are able to do is make them available to the public. But in this case, this is a book that, to my knowledge, hasn't been digitized yet. So it was really an opportunity to take something that was, in Hebrew they would say otzar galum, this treasure that had not yet been made available, and make it available. So to me, that was really exciting. And the way I sort of fell upon it, as I mentioned, was my cousin mentioned it to me when I was visiting the Spanish-Portuguese shul in New York. And he said, oh, you should take a look at this. And I'd never heard of it before. And I started looking, and I was really intrigued because there's a whole history encapsulated in these questions. They're talking about things that really capture the time frame that was very unique and interesting. What I didn't know is, as I was talking to my cousin and he sort of mentioned this, I started looking into this. In parallel, Daniel had reached out to my organization and had said, hey, are you guys interested in working on this book? And so there were these email paths that crossed in the night. We didn't find each other. After my cousin had reached out to me, I also wrote to Daniel privately and said, "Hey, I don't know if you know, we haven't met, but I heard and I saw that you wrote about this project. Maybe you'd be interested in working with me." And a little bit of digital mayhem. We didn't catch each other for a couple of months, but then at some point we managed to hook up, and it led to where we are now, which is this opportunity to work together where Daniel really has a very broad knowledge of the Pri Ets Haim and the broader context, and the work I'm doing allows me to be involved at the level of taking these images, make it digitized into text, and then using technology to help analyze the text and provide it and make it more accessible to people. So I was very, very excited about the project, and we still are. We're about halfway through some of the work we're doing, and it's really amazing opportunity that we're part of. Yeah, I'm really excited about it.
Yeah, I think it's a wonderful project. I'll say for myself personally, over the past couple of months, the past year, I've become more interested in the Amsterdam Jewish community, especially the Spanish-Portuguese community. And it's one of those things where I think it's a shame, obviously, and especially it's horrible what happened to them in the Holocaust and really how the community was decimated. But it's a shame, really, that you don't have many people working on works in Amsterdam. And in a lot of communities, you do see new editions of Sfarim coming out, new academic books, etc. And there's been a lot of academic research done on Amsterdam. But and if anyone can correct me who's listening to this and says I'm wrong, but I found there's a lot of academic research done on early Amsterdam, the origins of the community, and the kind of first generation of Shalev Mortera, da Fonseca, Yashman Israel, etc. But as you proceed past that, there isn't that much that's done on a lot of the rabbis that come later. Shlomo Shalem, and then there's the alone, and there's Chaim Debrito, and we'll get into many other ones, and a lot of other ones in the community isn't as much work done. A lot of those works are not redone, and Amsterdam was the printing capital. It took over for Italy as the printing place for a while in the Jewish world and the world generally. And so, it's unfortunate that a lot of these Rabbanim and these figures, their Sfarim, are just kind of languishing, not being published, nothing's happening with them. So this is really, and as everything, it needs somebody to do it, or somebody's, and it also needs money and work, and so there's a lot involved, and these are really tshuvas published by Yeshiva, published by Rabbanim, and a lot of them end up taking positions later, and so, this is an important work. So, I'll give it back to you, Professor Francis.
Daniel.
I'll call you Daniel. I keep calling him Josh. I go like Professor, Doctor. I'll call you Daniel. We'll go with first
Daniel.
name. Exactly.
Daniel,
and Josh, I didn't ask you if I should do that. So we'll go back to that. So
Perfect.
Daniel, I'll go back to you with if you. I know I said a little bit of the context. If you want to add any more background and context to the Pri Ets Haim, and then we can get to how it started, how the yeshiva decided to start a journal.
Yeah. So the what I would mention is that my source of information is two books. One in the 1930s, a German gentleman by a man called Max Hirsch spent about a decade or more going through all the shuvas, summarizing them all as a short introduction to the process, and it's all in German. It's called Fruchtens Lebens, in German, the Pri Ets Haim, and that is the primordial work. So the other one is in 1919, the Dutch community hired two historians, or used two historians, to write on the 300th anniversary, because they traced back the beginning of the Talmud Torah in Amsterdam to 1619. They said, this is the 300th anniversary, we need to write a history. And it's in Dutch. And it's hidden. It isn't very well known. So recently, using ChatGPT, I'm not a translator either, but using ChatGPT, I've translated both works into English, and I'm working at refining it and getting them, and we're going to post that on this website that we have. So the work on the 300th anniversary is really amazing because it really spells out the history that you just summarized, and then plus. And there are two significant pieces of information in there, which I think I want to share with the readers. One is that they found in a certain year, I don't recall exactly, look it up, that the students were disappearing. The better students were getting married, they were getting jobs, they had to get income, and so they were leaving the yeshiva. And this was seen as a problem by the yeshiva. This is back in the late 1600s, and the community decided to add a tax specifically to support these young men to allow them to continue to learn. So I think this is the first kollel that ever existed. They didn't call it kollel. When I looked up kollel on Wikipedia, I got something like out of the 1800s. I think the Talmidim of the Vilna Gaon started a kollel in Yerushalayim. But this is really the first kollel. In this 300th anniversary document, they even specify how much each student got, how much the rabbis got. It's very financially oriented in terms of it brings out the financial records. So that's one piece of information which I think is worth knowing. So when we think of these students writing these tshuvas, you tend to think of a student like 2022 and disappears. No, these were people who wrote over a period of 30, 40, some even 50 years tshuva. So they were there. They're not Yingalite. They were Kollel Avrachim. They spent their life there. And at any given time, there were 5 to 9 of them. So, and that wrote, which I presume there were many who were learning there who did not write. So I would imagine that there were about 20 members of the Kollel, the Ets Haim Kollel, sitting and learning full time, supported by the community. I think that's worth sharing. The other thing is they instituted late 1600s, and I don't know why, I can only guess, that they wanted the students to deal with the tshuva. They wanted them to be able to paska. They weren't happy that they were just learning. So they instituted that once a month, a student would come up with an interesting question, or the Rabbanim would come up with an interesting question. Sometimes it was real, sometimes it was not real. It's hard to know, but I'm sure it was based on the reality. And they would throw this out, and one student was then appointed to answer the question, and it became a whole institution. They debated the answer. They had another guy that would try to answer it. And at the end, on every Rosh Chodesh, they would put out to the students, this is the tshuva, this is the final version of the tshuva. Then in 1728, which is about 30 years later, they decided, we're going to fund publishing this. This is good stuff. We shouldn't just have it in paper. And so they went to Proops, and they paid Proops to publish it. I think there was something later on where they wanted people to pay another tax for printing this. David Sklar looked into this also, and he said even though the yeshiva, if you like, was having financial troubles, they persisted in being able to publish this for 80 years. So this went on month in, month out. That's it. So that's another historical aspect.
It's pretty amazing. They publish this monthly journal, one psak halacha for 80 years.
Yes.
And you mentioned Proops. Proops is the famous Amsterdam printer, the family for decades, for centuries. And they actually, you'll notice on any of their books, they have the famous insignia of the Kahanim, the hands spread out, the Star Trek salute now, if you will, right? And so they have that there in the front of the in this farm, so you can see the Proops farm. They were very famous. So when we're talking about it, just Daniel, one more thing. When we talk about, we say 13 volumes, 80 years. I mean, just to be clear, they're not major volumes. But when we talk about how big are these volumes? How many tshuvas are we speaking of that were published?
952 we have.
Which is a lot of tshuvas, and they're not all so small. So this is 952 tshuvas, and there's just pretty unknown in the world. I mean, we can get to this later, but just here, have you, just to say how unknown they are, have you discovered, are these quoted in the halachic literature? Have you found anyone quoting them?
Okay, so that's interesting you mentioned that, because that brings me a little bit to how I got involved with digitization and my interest. I learned that the Yaakov Spiegel, who he is a professor at Bar Ilan, I believe, and he's involved with the Tshuva, the Bar Ilan Tshuva project. And so I know him because he was in Toronto for a while. And so I went into the Tshuva bank to see if the Pri Ets Haim was quoted. And it was. Not extensively, but it was. So there were Tshuvas in there that referred to the Tshuvas of the Pri Ets Haim. And then I asked him, I contacted him, and I said, would he consider including the Pri Ets Haim in the Shalos and Tshuvas bank? And he says it's a huge project. It's going to take a huge amount of resources. If I have a donor that is willing to make a hefty donation, he will consider it. To which I said, no, I don't. But if I somehow get them digitized, will you accept them? And he said, yeah, sure. So I started digitizing, and I contacted Dicta, but that already, Josh already mentioned that. But yeah, they have been quoted. I can't say extensively. But people have written, historians have written a few articles on certain tshuvas, which I will give you examples later on. And it's fascinating because they deal with issues that tell what the time was like, and they give you a halachic aspect. The tshuvas some of them are 4 or 5 pages, some are 30 or 40 pages long. 2 columns go on, and they're very extensive and very intricate, and interesting.
So when you say 80 years, they were published every month without fail, or were there missed issues?
Okay, so that's something I did in the article that I published, is the sense that I only have the dates when they were written. They did not, when they put them out, they didn't put a cover saying this is Rosh Chodesh Sivan. The tshuva appeared, and without knowledge of when exactly it came out. So I did an analysis because they were published in sequence, and you have the date. So I did an analysis of putting myself in the publisher's seat. How many do I have in inventory? Because I assume that they're going to be printed in the order. Now, there was also an approval process that they had to go through. So I did identify about 20 or so months over the 80 years, so maybe, altogether, that they had to miss a month here, a month there, where in some cases, they didn't have anybody who had written, but the inventory went down to 0. But in most cases, they had some in inventory, but they weren't published, which I presume there was a delay. I saw in one case that somebody said somebody was ill. One of the Rosh Yeshivas was ill, and they weren't able to do it. But pretty well, it was a forced schedule of we have to come up with something every month.
I think I read on somewhere that as well, this might be the first Hebrew periodical published, which is also quite unique.
Yeah, I know that. I was telling you before we got on that I recently got a volume of, there's 3 Sfarim. Someone printed a facsimile of 3 different Sfarim, including Iter Bikurei Katzir, which was the Pachad Yitzchak, Yitzchak Lampranti from Italy, from Ferrara, his journal. That actually, some of that was redone, and Professor Spiegel did a Sefer Konimas Hakan, and we took some stuff from there. But that was published together with Sefer Ets Haim. So I'm not sure if that's the same as a Pri Ets Haim. It also is these tshuvas, or there was an earlier publication done separately. But I bring this up because the Iter Bikurei Katzir, Lamprantis, I think it was like 2 issues, and then it stopped. 1 or 2. I remember from Professor Spiegel's Konimas Hakan, and that was early also, but I believe that's later. I think it's around the same time period. I think it starts later.
I think I'm. It's a little bit on a limb, but I recently was at JTS, and they showed me a 1742 sefer, which sounds like what you have, but the original print. That's 3 copies actually. That's 3 copies, and the interesting thing is that there was a period in the 300th anniversary document. They say there was a 5-year period in which Proops did not publish the tshuvas. Another printer printed them, and then I went back to the Pri Ets Haim, and I saw that the hands at the end were missing in that period. And I believe that the book that you have was also other tshuvas that Adler then printed, because it's the same period in which there was a dead period from Proops. So this is an area that has to be looked into, and I haven't had a chance.
So when we say that it was published, you said there was no title page, none of that. Were these published almost like parsha sheets people would be used to today, like being distributed, and then later on bound into a volume and put out as a sefer at a title page? Is that what happened?
Yeah, that's exactly what happened, and it wasn't put into even the volume numbers were confusing because people labeled volumes depending on who was doing the binding. And Manco Hirsch really brought it all under order and numbered each one and put a structure over it. But it was the binding that was later on. I don't know what synchronization took place between the binders, because the volumes found in one place have the same tshuvas as the volumes found somewhere else. So, and there's difficulty getting, the whole collection isn't in one place. If I may say this now, when I looked into where they are, I found that the Ets Haim library is missing some volumes. They don't have all the volumes. And I asked this to the librarian, they were never there. And then I went on Google Books and I started searching, and lo and behold, I found Pri Ets Haim tshuvas that were not in the library of the Ets Haim on Google Books. So I went and asked people in the Netherlands, and I found out that Google went to universities and libraries all over Holland, and they just scanned. They had a truck, or I don't know how they did, what it looked like, but they scanned everything. But they didn't catalog it. So there's stuff in Google Books that is buried, that is not there. And unfortunately, Google Books will not release the scans. So now we're in the process of working with Holland where they're rescanning them. But the bottom line is that there was some synchronization between binders so that you have volumes, well-defined volumes. That came later.
So one more question on the physical aspect of things, Daniel. Do we know how this was distributed? So I mentioned, was it like Parsha sheets and then it was bound later with a title page? Do we know how it was distributed monthly and then how it was distributed once it was into a book, or we have no idea?
I have no idea. It's probably the honest answer. I know that I have read that the number of copies that they printed was not huge. It was in the 20s or something like that. Who it went to, I have heard it be said by some academics in the Netherlands, is maybe alumni overseas to keep in touch with the institution, because you had to be a Talmud Chacham to read these. I mean, the question might be interesting, but the bulk of the volume was in the answer. So it was pretty select group, and I think maybe to keep in touch. In terms of after they were bound, there are copies. There are maybe half a dozen copies. At the time that Menko Hirsch wrote his work in the 30s, there were none at the Hebrew University. There were none at the National Library. The National Library, I now went back. There's a little interesting clip that the library that was associated with the yeshiva was in Ben Gurion went there in the 50s and said it's a shame nobody's looking after this valuable collection, so he shipped it to the National Library of Israel. In the 2000s, the Dutch community says this is a treasure, we need to ship it back, and so they came back, and this they're now in the Netherlands. Now this came up because the scans that I got from the Netherlands were inferior to the scans that I got in the National Library, which meant they scanned it while they had the volumes. I went there recently. They don't have the volumes anymore, but they've built up their collection from different collectors. So not only do they come in volumes, people do have individual issues that they happen to have, that they purchased on the antique market or whatever it is, and they have been buying those up. So the ones that the National Library of Israel has have not even been, some of them are different bindings of different numbers, sometimes not even sequence, they miss things. So people have put together bindings, but the official bindings is the 13 volumes. How those were distributed, I have no idea. Sorry.
Now, about published, you mentioned 1728 to 1808.
Yeah.
Do we know, and that was continuous, do we know why it stopped? And then you mentioned Pri Ets Haim HaChadash.
Yeah, okay. So the reason it stopped is because the Jewish life became extremely uncertain because the government started meddling in. They saw that they had these Jewish communities, Sephardi, Ashkenazi communities that were run on their own. They didn't mix in with the government. They didn't speak Dutch. They either spoke Yiddish or they very aristocratic, the Sephardim, but they had their own government. They had their own courts. And the government said, no, it's time to integrate these Jews. And so people thought, what's going to happen? And so the people going to yeshiva, putting their futures there, they stopped doing that. So there was lack of supply of people who were willing to put their futures in a very uncertain environment. Then the government wanted a process whereby somebody becomes a rabbi. You can't just become a rabbi and say, because somebody appointed me. There has to be a test. There has to be matriculation. There has to be a process. So they instituted a whole educational system that was documented in law. And for example, to be a mohel, you have to do this. To be a teacher at this level, you have to get to that. You have to have exams. And so the question was, what do we do with the highest level of rabbi? They called moreh. In the Netherlands, they had three levels of rabbanim. They had darshan, which allowed you to have a small community, a magid, which allowed you to give a shiur, so to say, and a moreh, which allowed you to paskin. And how do we? And they decided to give them to have them write Shalos and Shuvas as their exam. Now it's interesting that there were two rabbis, a rabbi from the Ashkenazi community, a monk from the Sephardi community. I don't have a great memory, so I'd have to look up the names. But they debated what they should do. The Ashkenazi had these pointed questions to know whether the guy knew something, whereas the Sephardim had these long stories and what do you do in this situation? And at the beginning, the exam sort of consisted of a combination, but it evolved into all long stories. The Sephardi way went ahead. And one interesting thing is that you had to be makel. You could not, if you were machmir in the answer, you would fail the exam. If you were makel for the wrong reasons, you failed the exam. Only if you were makel for the right reasons where you pass the exam. And there are many instances when students failed the exams. So all these tshuvas came as a tradition from the Pri Ets Haim. The contributors were tremendous, if I may say this. The contributors had a command of the Hebrew language, which is astonishing. So each of these, when the first time that a student would start writing the tshuva, they would write a hakdama, and a very elaborate, poetic, putting themselves down and then also raising themselves. So their ability in the Hebrew language was just amazing of the contributors. But we don't know that much about them.
Yeah, you mentioned the rabbis. So, I mean, there were many rabbis that were there. The Lowenstam family, you had Rabbi Leib and Rabbi Shol and Rabbi Leib again. One of the Israel. The Lowenstams were there, obviously. Or but I mentioned the ones that were earlier. At some point, the Chacham Tzvi was there. At some point, the Meister Rakeach was there. And you meant, they had the Sephardi. Originally, it was predominantly just Spanish, Portuguese, just Sephardim. Then you had the Ashkenazi community. Eventually, the Ashkenazi community becomes bigger. So you have kind of both communities there. So one thing that we didn't mention about it is who the contributors were. I mean, we mentioned it's the Yeshiva Bachrim, or the Young Light and Koil, essentially, is what they were. They would not have used those terms. But that's who was contributing from Ets Haim. Do you know any of their names?
Yeah, we have all their names. There were 42 of them. And they contributed on an average, engineering average of 14 years per, but they ranged. Some of them were 30, 40, 50 years. At any given time, they had about 5 to 10 people writing tshuva. So it wasn't like one person writing, month after month. It was always intermingled, different authors every month. And at any given period, there were anywhere, like I said, from 5 to 10 people writing over this 80-year period. We know very little biographic information about them, which is unfortunate, which I'm trying to correct. That's another project that I plan to work on, is who were these people. We do have their names. The David ben Raphael Meldola, I think you, in previous conversations, you mentioned familiarity with him. So he's one of the authors. We have all the names listed. What I did do is to try to get a little bit more of an insight into their characters. There's one of the first guy, his last name was Gomez, so he wrote an introduction to it. Introductions to Hakdamot were typically four or five paragraphs, and in one paragraph he says, "Ve'elidi dibarti," I spoke to myself, im einani limili, because he just finished saying how little he knows and how junior he is and what does he know. And he says, "Bimenani limili ki od yesh li ruchi bekirbi." I still have a spirit, the yesh li koach beyadi, and I have power in my hands. So v'chen hit gabarti, I became, daring. V'ken kulmus achazti, and I took my pen. V'et ktonet atzlut me'alai pashatzti, and I took off my clothing of loneliness off me. The asuret masveh habusha me'alai, I took away my mask of busha. Ve'yeh oz kanemer lamod ala perek ve'parshat dalchei hagiyora lahashiv lehoshoaleh davar. In other words, I will stand up and do the job. They're Hebrew. I showed it to somebody yesterday who's Israeli, and he says, "This is amazing. This is 1730 Hebrew," which you sometimes see Rishonim, and maybe you see it elsewhere, but I don't see much. So I think as a literary work, I think it's worth publicizing, the Hakdamot as well.
Yeah, their Hebrew was really good. They learned, obviously, grammar, and sure, there's something that was going on in Italy and now in Amsterdam. They learned, and then after this, later on, you mentioned Rabbi David Meldola, someone that I've been looking into recently, and he was part of the circle of the Ramchal. The Ramchal shows up, obviously, the Ramchal has a really beautiful Hebrew, and the Ramchal's there, and there's others involved. I think one of the ones I saw is Yaakov Basan. He becomes rabbi in Hamburg, and
Yes,
he
yes,
Basan, not related to the Ramchal's Rebbe, Rabbi Shayo Basan in Italy, but he's a different Basan. He, together with Rabbi David Moldola, are the editors of Mesilas Yesharim, so they're involved with him. There's Rabbi David Frankel Mendes. I don't know if he writes here. If
yes,
he's in here.
yes. The
There's many.
Mendes.
And listeners will hear there's a lot of Spanish and Portuguese sounding last names, like non-Jewish. But like these are names that if you're familiar with these communities, you'll realize that not these were again former conversos, so not all the names will be Jewish necessarily. They'll be these are
No Jewish names here.
yeah
Israel.
exactly.
There's one guy called Israel. All these names that you've mentioned, they were part of the author list of the 42 authors. What I call.
Yeah, so there is that. Okay, so one more thing I wanted to just ask you. There's the Rosh Yeshiva in charge of the yeshiva, who I think is sometimes a chief rabbi, sometimes not. I may be wrong on that, but what is his role in here? Does he step in? Does he write any tshuvas that whoever the Rosh Yeshiva is of Ets Haim at any time, or no?
Yeah, I have the list. I have the list of rectors at the yeshiva at the time. The names, I'd have to look them up, but they did the approval. So nothing would go at the end of the tshuva and say, I hope I didn't make any mistakes. This is not lehalachad until, it gets approved. And they made it very clear that these were not authoritative pieces until they were approved by the Rosh Yeshiva. And sometimes there were delays in the approval process. So the Rosh Yeshiva took responsibility for this publication, for the psak in the publication.
Okay, so as Daniel said here, some of these shuvas were real, some were not. The questions, some were real, some were not real questions, invented, whether based on reality. What kind of issues are we talking about that are presented in the journal? Josh, I'll turn to you if you want to answer. What kind of issues are we seeing arise in these many respondents? 952, I think you said, respondents.
Yeah, so there are a lot of interesting topics, and it's, I think, very much bound by the time that it involves in. And I think Daniel will go into some examples, but the one example that sort of caught my eye when I was going through them was the example of a Ashkenazic rabbi who was part of the Sephardic community, and they spent a lot of time describing how beautiful his voice was, and he was a Baal Koreh. But when he got to a certain pasuk, which says Patsua Daka, he said, oh, there's a mistake in the Sefer. I can't read from the Sefer because it's spelled incorrectly. Bring me another Sefer. At which point they said, well, all our Sfarim are written this way. You're going to not find one written differently. And that led to a question about, well, can an Ashkenazic rabbi read from a Sephardi Torah where he's not mutzi himself? He's not creating the obligation himself, but he's trying to mutzi the others on their obligation from hearing the Torah be read. I think that's a really great question because it captures this blend of the Ashkenazic and Sephardic community where they're maybe for the first time really integrating in Amsterdam. Daniel, I don't know if you spent more time researching that tshuva, but it's fantastic tshuva that really deals with some interesting topics. Maybe I think in the tshuva he says how he looked and didn't see anybody else who dealt with this issue, which may be first at his time frame. I think David Sklar did some research on this as well, right? Did you have Professor Sklar on your podcast as well at one point?
Professor Sklar has been on a number of times talking about Ramchal and the Rambam and things. Not on this. Eventually, I have to get him on Ets Haim and the Ets Haim library. I mean, it's something that, like I said earlier, I have to really do more in Amsterdam. I've been in contact with Heidi Varnko, who's now the librarian, and perhaps talk to her about the Ets Haim library and what goes on there. I mean, there's a lot more to discuss. So yeah, I didn't discuss this. I know that he's looked into some Shu't Pri Ets Haim and some of the responses here as well.
Yeah, they have pretty well covered it. I think they end up concluding that they end up also asking what happens if an Ashkenazi walks into a Sephardi minyan or the other way around. Can he get an aliyah? And they paskin that he can, and then they comment that this takes place all the time. And then they say, even though Bnei Israel are not Nevi'im, the Bnei Nevi'im, so they're getting it right, even though they unintentionally they're getting it right, that they do allow people to get aliyahs in each other's communities.
Yeah, and there are a lot of other topics covered. One of the things that was really impressive that Menko Hirsch did when he created the index, he also created a list of topics. And that was something that I thought was very exciting to do. And we did this with the digital version that we're creating of the Pri Ets Haim, is we used AI and computational technology to create a list of topics that each Shela, what topics are covered. And then we created a topic index. And so that allows people to search through the Pri Ets Haim in a different way than it would have been otherwise, which is by topic. So if you're interested in, a Sofer Stam, and you want to look about mezuzah, you can navigate to that topic and see the Shailot and Tshuva that deal with mezuzah, for example. And I think there's a real opportunity now to try and make accessible all this information, these Shailot and Tshuva that were hidden away almost.
Yeah, and we'll
Josh,
get back. I want to
yeah.
say we'll get more back the Dicta and the AI. I think that's really fascinating as relates to Sfarim in general, and we'll get more to that, Josh, once we after we some more examples here with the Pri Ets Haim. So Daniel, I want to turn to you if you have any other examples that you can point out from the Pri Ets Haim.
Yeah, so there another example, which I think is very interesting, is a question from this is a real question that came to them from a Marano in Portugal. Who these Maranos in Portugal? People think of 1492, but they continued to live in Portugal in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, and they lived under the threat of death for being Jewish. If anybody thought that they were going back to, because they were sent their kids to Jesuit seminaries, they went to church, did everything that a Christian would do. So this particular Marano wanted to be sent Judaica from the Netherlands, and he said, please don't tell anyone, because if you do, if anybody finds out, then I could be burnt on the stake. And so the question was, how do we deal with this person? Is this person Jewish? Can we send him objects, mezuzot or tefillin or sidurim? This person is Christian, and also, can we risk his life? Because if we send him and he gets burnt, and we're accomplices in that act. So the bulk of the tshuva is getting the status of these Maranos while they were in Portugal. Are they Jewish? Yes or not? When they come to Holland, do they need Giyur? Do they need to be Megayer? Do they need to have do they need Tvila? Or they just Mila? They were not circumcised. It was a standard thing. Adults are coming to the Netherlands. So we finally come here. We want to be Jewish now. They were not Mal, so the Mila had to take place. That was the first thing. Some of them didn't want to get the Mila because they said, as soon as I get the Mal, then I have to do mitzvahs, and I don't want to have to keep Shabbos and kashrus. So give me a break, and we'll do this next November. I'll get the Mila, and then I'll do the things. And the Rabbanim said, no. Whether or not you have Mila, you're still mechuyev in all the mitzvahs right now. Anyway, so this dealt with the status. The bottom line question at the end, which again reflects the practice, is that the chazaka was that they did not intermarry. The non-Jews in Portugal knew that they were part of a new Christian community. They weren't called Maranos, they were called new Christians. They were always under threat because they were suspected them that even though they were new Christians, they were doing Jewish things in private. The truth is they didn't know anything. They may have done some things in private, but they're very, not halachically based at all. So because they did not intermarry, they only did Mila. They did no Tefillah when they came back. And this shuva is considered to be somewhat the place where their status is determined at length. A lot of Achronim abroad, Rishonim abroad on this issue. It's a very lomdish thing, and it's very interesting. Now, the other two that one mentioned, one is regarding a slave girl. This is in Curacao. This takes place in Curacao. A man Reuven had a maidservant, a slave, which people had, and he needed to go to Holland for a couple of years. And Holland had abolished slavery, and he was afraid that if he takes her with him, she'll escape. She'll see that, hey, I really shouldn't be here. I'm a right to be free. I'm a human being. And so he didn't want to take her with him. And so his friend Shimon said, I'll take care of her while you're away. And we won't exchange any money. I'll take care of her. When you get back, I'll give her back to you. Well, in the 2-year period, she gave birth to a boy. So Reuven, who was the guy who went to Holland, said, the boy is mine. She comes with the mother. And Shimon said, no, the father is my slave. It's mine. And so this came as a shaila to Amsterdam. What do we do? Do we split the value? Anyway, the psak was that when it comes to legitimate relationships, the child goes with the father. But when it comes to other than these standard legitimate, kedushin children from a regular marriage, then it goes with the mother. So proof after proof was that the child goes with the mother, and there's no question about that. But it's an unusual setting. You don't find that in many. But finally, the last one is this guy wants to send shipments to Brazil, and he's standing at the dock, and he wants insurance. He wants to insure his shipment. So he stands next to a guy who sells insurance, and he says, Shimon, I need to send these goods, so much value. How much are you going to charge me? He says, well, I need to know information about the ship. I said, well, the ship is on sea, and it's not going to be in the port very long, but it's exactly the same as the one in front of me. It's just as seaworthy as the one in front of us. He says, really? And based on that, he gives them a quote, and they seal the deal with a handshake. The ship gets pirated, gets sunk. They go for a claim. The guy said, I looked into this, and the ship that you pointed to had so many cannons, so many shields. The one that was sunk had fewer shields and cannons, so it was a greater risk. So I don't owe you anything. So the comes to the halacha. The halacha is basically that they determine whether this cannonware is essential part of the ship. There's a mission that deals with this, that when you sell a ship, what is included? And what's not included is the little boats that the ships carry, stuff that is not essential for the voyage. And they deem that this cannonware is not essential to the voyage. The ship can go fine. And anyway, the answer is the more technical, but the question is amazing. There's an article on this as well that I would put to the readers as a reference later on. And there's many more questions that are not your typical tshuva that you expect to see, and they're a sign of the times of the lives that they led.
Yeah, this is the times of the Dutch Republic, and even after the decline. But the Netherlands was a world power at the time. And they had, you mentioned Curacao. It's interesting. Curacao was, I think it still is, not even was part of the Netherlands. It still is. But so Curacao allowed slavery, but in the Netherlands itself, they outlawed slavery. And, at some point, Suriname was, and some other islands and some other areas. At one early point, Brazil, but then that wasn't. The Portuguese reconquered it. So, I mean, this was a powerful. Obviously, we know New York. We know New York was New Amsterdam. So the Dutch were very powerful at one point, and so we were talking about communities all over connected, and so yeah, they were getting responses. Amsterdam was still the kind of capital of the Spanish Portuguese community, even when the communities went to other like Livorno and Hamburg. Livorno's in Italy, Hamburg in Germany, London, and then all throughout the Atlantic and Americas as well. The communities in Philadelphia, New York, Charleston, South Carolina. I mean, these are really bastions of Spanish Portuguese communities. But then at some point, it still is the Amsterdam community is still the main community with the Ets Haim Yeshiva at its head. So you really have these fascinating tshuvas and really a fascinating community. You mentioned the Mila issue. I think famously, this is well known. Spinoza's grandfather never got bris Mila, so he's buried outside the cemetery. He wasn't buried in there. They didn't let him be buried in there. There's some sort of discussion on this. So this is something that happened. This is a community that was unique in that regard, and so a lot of these tshuvas, like I said, are very interesting. So with all that, there's this massive collection of responsa you've been working on, and now I'll turn to Josh and what Dicta. So I think we need to tell the listener what Dicta does. You mentioned AI and different technology, different computer tools. What Dicta does, and then how it relates to Pri Ets Haim, what you're doing here with this project, specifically with Dicta.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so Dicta's goal is to create and improve what's available to the public, or specifically around Hebrew text and using computation. So AI, which is now more people are familiar with, like ChatGPT, but even before that, our goal is to create a body of works that is available and tools that can really alleviate some of the hard processes that are involved in going and working with text and Hebrew text specifically. And this is founded by Moshe Capel, put together a lot of work around this, and this has been his vision to put together and create this organization that will provide a service to the public. And we have a bunch of tools, and I think the Pri Ets Haim is like a flagship of what can be done with all this technology. We have these books, and the printing press has been around for quite a while, and a lot of rabbinic and Hebrew texts that have been produced. And I think we're at the cusp of really understanding how we can use all this technology to improve the accessibility and the usability of these texts. And that's what we're focused on. So specifically to talk about the Pri Ets Haim, we've been working there's a number of stages. The first stage is you're starting with these books that are been printed or facsimiles, and there are images, or we need to scan them. And then we digitize them, we make them available in text. And so around that's something we spent a lot of time specializing in the Rashi font that is very popular at this time and throughout a lot of the publications in the 16th, 17th, 18th century, even 19th century, the Rashi font in Vilna and other places. And so we've trained OCR, which is the process of taking an image and converting it into digital text. We've trained our own models to be specifically good at the Rashi font and overcome some of the issues there. We've used our technology so that we can take an image of text and convert it into digital text, and then it's usable in a lot of other formats. So that's like the first step in this process. The other thing we're doing is we have tools that'll add vocalization, nikud, to the text automatically. And I should point out now that there's a lot of work, and we've been spending a lot of time to improve the accuracy of the tools that we provide and of the technology and the text that we provide. But like any other AI technology, it's not 100%. There are errors, there are mistakes that can be found in it. But our goal is to make these things just easier to access and use. And so in the case of the Pri Ets Haim, we've added automatically nikud to the entire Pri Ets Haim that we've digitized. We're so far about halfway through. As Daniel said, the 13 volumes, we're about halfway through. We've done 6 volumes so far. About 490 of the tshuvot we've already digitized. And we're in the process of doing more of them. So besides that's nikud, which you spoke about, I also mentioned before the idea of automatically creating an index. So something that would have been done by hand, as was done by Minko Hirsch, we do automatically for this book. And we take each Sheila and Tshuva, and we go through and we create tools that allow us to find topics and create a topical index. So that way you can search through the book by topic. The other things we're doing in this product, which allows you to access it in a very convenient way, is we also write short summaries of each Sheila and Tshuva, so that you can get a quick glimpse of what the topic of information is. And one of the things that we're working on right now, which is really exciting, is a lot of times in the text you'll have citations, like K'mo shekatav Rambam b'Hilchot. But sometimes the citations are very non-obvious and ambiguous. So that's one of the things we're working with our partners, Sefaria. Sefaria has technology that we're working with them so that we can identify when it says K'mo shekatav Rambam, and it doesn't tell you where that is, but then afterwards he cites a part of the Rambam, we can connect all that together so we can create a citation index automatically. So that a lot of the Sfarim that you may have in modern publications, in the back you'll have an index by source, by the where is it in the Gemara, where's the Rambam, and you can work your way backwards. And I think that's what's exciting about the opportunity now with this Pri Ets Haim, is not only to take a text that's mostly unknown, digitize it, but to bring it and prepare it in a way that makes it accessible from all different ways using these AI technologies. And I think that's something that what we're talking about doing that now, and this is a flagship product, the Pri Ets Haim. I think we could do that for other books, and I think there's an opportunity to think about how to integrate this technology into the things that are going on in the publication of Jewish works now.
So you mentioned OCR, and I'm sure listeners are familiar with that, scanning the image into text. So what's the AI comes in creating the other things once it's scanned, once it's now digitized, that's where the AI kicks in?
So yeah, we have AI in the OCR process, meaning when you're taking an image and you're converting it into text. So the first part is to understand the letters. And we trained an AI to understand the Rashi font letters that appear. The next part is to use AI and language to understand language well enough to understand what kind of words could appear. So we automatically correct errors. So as you're doing, typically you'll have a lot of times you'll have errors that happen during this OCR process. And because at Dicta we spend time to understand the Hebrew language, the rabbinic Hebrew language, we're able to automatically correct errors and do a better job at digitization. Of course, there's always more work to do, and we have a human review process. But the human review process of the OCR is only on 2-3% of the words, because we have the computer automatically verify the rest of the words. And then after we do that, we use AI in things that are maybe more familiar, similar to ChatGPT, where you can create a summary of the text. You can ask the AI to help you figure out what topics are available. And we use technology like that. And we have our own technologies that we build that are AI-based that allow us to find sources. So when you upload the Pri Ets Haim, there are a lot of sources that aren't referenced, but we are able to identify where they come from by matching it against the entire rabbinic library that we have accessible to us.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about quality control, and like you're saying, you could just do a sampling essentially of selections rather than going over the entire thing to see what errors are, what are. And then it's a very exciting tool, very exciting opportunity, especially for many old Sfarim. There are many things out of print, not available, old print, not accessible, lack of sources, etc. And this really can, help. Obviously, there are, as you mentioned, errors, and you have to keep training it and keep working on it. But manually also there are errors, and also I think the biggest issue with manually is that money and time and effort, it's a lot. This has the opportunity to, even with its shortcomings, proceed past that. But something I'm interested in, and you mentioned this, rabbinic Hebrew, you're training it. As Daniel mentioned earlier, that the Hebrew here in the Pri Ets Haim, for example, in Amsterdam was a very sophisticated, if you will, Hebrew for the time. But you go to different locations, depending on where you are in the Jewish world, and the Jewish world is very varied throughout the centuries, the Hebrew is a little different. Even rabbinic Hebrew is not always the same. So when you're training a computer and how does that work?
Right. So it's a very good question. I mean, there are definitely different genre of the Hebrew language and the rabbinic Hebrew. And if you look across time, you'll see this shift from the Aramaic being very heavy influence to partial influence to this sort of blend of Hebrew and Aramaic together, and you get all these sort of variances that are non-standard but prevalent in the writings. And so that's been a challenge for us that we've constantly working on, and we try to cover both ranges. In the extreme, we have modern Hebrew work that we're doing, and we have rabbinic Hebrew. And our aim is to try and train for both possibilities. But like you said, there are a lot of dialects, as it were, within each genre of language. And that is a challenge that we spend a lot of time working on. One of the things that's sort of exciting in works like these is that they rely very heavily on biblical Hebrew or references to psukim, and they may use it almost in conversationally. You'll see they'll say, like, I was looking for something in nav and nad to find an answer, and you can smell how they use the biblical Hebrew throughout their writing. It's really beautiful, and it's something that appears quite a lot in these type of Shela V'Tshuva.
Malitza, yeah, they would very often write a Malitza, and they would do that all the time. The Chita comes to mind, especially read Michael Tovitz. The whole book is essentially Malitza. So yeah, this is very often very common. So another thing to ask, this is something that you're saying, Pri Ets Haim, it sounds like you've undertaken it, you're connected and you're doing it. Is Dicta, is the plan for Dicta to be a service offer that people can hire you and say, hey, I have this book, I have this work, I want to get it done, can I have it done? Is it like people can pay essentially for it, or this is something that we're undertaking to do this and that and the other, we're working on research? How does that come into play?
That's a good question. So Dicta is an organization with a lot of people who've been working on this project, and I think it's very important. Before I forget to call out, there's a huge team at Dicta who've been involved in this process and all different technologies and the implementation. So really an exciting opportunity for all of us to work on this. Dicta's focus is on the technology. And so we partner with people like Sefaria, who have a store of all the texts, and they do quite amazing work. And where our goal is to be the technology that helps enable a lot of the things that are going on. For example, Sefaria has a search engine for the Tanakh that is our search engine, and we gave them. And that's where we see ourselves as a technology that can be implemented and enable tools. In this case, Pri Ets Haim, we are almost like a publisher. We're taking this all the way from digitization of the text, the images, all the way through to a website where people can access the texts. But that's not primarily our focus. We're not a publisher as sorts. We're a technology, and we hope that people can use our technology to improve the work they're doing. There are things that we hope people can just take our technology. For example, you can upload a document, and we'll automatically identify citations and sources that are referenced. And so then you can use that to enhance your learning or find other sources or mark up the text as you're working with it. And we have other technologies like search technology. So if you're trying to find text or in the Talmud or etc., we help the user search in such a way that it's more intuitive. And so this is what Dicta is focused on, is technologies that can enable the use of the rabbinic world with streamlined, easy, sort of trying to be the Google of the rabbinic world, make everything easy for everybody to use it. But this is still an ongoing research projects that are going on. And yeah, I'd be happy for people to reach out to us and talk to us about their projects and if we can see that our technology can be of use. But at this point, we're very hyper focused on very few projects, and one of them is the Pri Ets Haim to get that publication process going.
Really cool. There's a lot of potential here, and that'll be amazing if this can, like you said, work out the issues and kind of as it gets more accurate and really better. But something else that's worth discussing here, as you mentioned, first of all, before we're discussing, you mentioned to reach out to you. So reach out, or any contact information, website. What can you share with the listeners if they're interested in getting in touch? That I can add a link to the show's notes as well.
Yeah, that'd be great. So the Pri Ets Haim is being published on the website called peh.dicta.org.il. And yeah, it'd be great if you could share that with your listeners. And there you can see the first about 500 Shu't Pri Ets Haim that we've been digitized and get access to it. And in general, if you go to dicta.org.il, that's our homepage, you'll see the tools and technologies that we've made available. And you can contact us there. We have a contact us link on the homepage. And before I forget, it's very important to call out the main contributors to Dicta is, as I mentioned, Professor Koppel and Professor Avi Schmidman, who are the founders of Dicta and have created this technology and enable this for the betterment of the public to access and use these technologies.
Now, what about, have you given any thought to publication? Meaning, of course, you're an online and a computer program, but classical Sfarim, especially, I think with Yidden, especially with Shabbos and Yom Tov, it's not going anywhere, publishing. And so people are still using classic Sfarim, classic texts. Has there been any thought to taking the Pri Ets Haim and publishing it? And I can say, even before you answer, I'll just add that, because you mentioned Sefaria, they gave Sefaria the text. There's someone contacted me. I don't have his name offhand, and I don't know if he's associated with Sefaria, just right. He's been taking texts on Sefaria that there's an interest in and turning them into PDF and then uploading it to Amazon now. Talk about technology, and it's print on demand. So you don't do any outlay, and you can just order it print on demand via Amazon paperback. It's not expensive. So there always is that option to just take when it's finished and put it on Amazon. It's a print on demand option. Anyone can order it. I assume, and that's the cheapest, most efficient way to do things, I guess. But the only drawback being that it's paperback. But it's still there's no real outlay of money, and it's quite affordable and easy and simple and prime, etc. But is there been any thought to actually publishing the Pri Ets Haim once the process is finished, or even now you have more than enough for one volume already?
Yeah, so it's interesting because that's not my world. The publishing world for Dicta is not where we're focused. And like you said, maybe there are other people out there who want to take this the next step and go ahead and think about how you would create this in a publishing format. But what I did do, and this references something you said earlier, is that this idea that maybe this was their weekly parsha sheets that they were printing out, taking to shul. I did just that, is I printed out the summaries that we created of the Shu't Pri Ets Haim, and I then used that, and I took that with me to shul, and I have that available, and I find that as a fun little read, while you're waiting between aliyot to enjoy something. So I think there's an opportunity in that venue of creating these texts, taking these texts, maybe there's some sort of processing if it's human or AI related, and then creating it and making it very digestible in a format that you can print at your home maybe and take with you. I think that's an interesting opportunity that's available with these texts that have been processed and made available. Yeah.
Daniel, I want to ask you what your involvement now is. So now that Josh is in the project has been, at Dicta, and as they're rolling it out, and again, I'll link in the show's notes, and I'll put it on the WhatsApp community and on Twitter. But where do you come into play here? And you mentioned the Pri Ets Haim Machadash, something that's in manuscript. Do you have any plans with that? Obviously, that's a whole different thing. I don't think the AI is trained on, there's no technology on manuscript, especially manuscript, all different type of hands depending on where they're from and different scripts. But what's your involvement with the current project, and what's your plans with the Pri Ets Haim Machadash that's in manuscript?
Okay, so with the current project, my job has been to get Josh just scans of high quality scans because I have the connections in Holland with the librarians and so on. So they are photographing right now. They're scanning right now as we speak. By the end of this month, they hope to have more done. So my job is to make sure that there is a supply line going into Dicta of the high quality scans for all of their tshuvas. So that's why I spent some time in the National Library of Israel this summer, seeing exactly what they have and how do we get that scanned. And we just talked about that yesterday. I will go ahead and order the scan, so he will have them. Also, I was at JTS looking for more high quality originals because he needs high quality. When you do a reprint like the one that you have, it's usually not good enough quality, or it creates so many errors that it becomes very inefficient. So when you get original printing, and JTS has original printing of some other tshuvas that we're looking into, so that's my job. That's my part of the project, is supplying Dicta with high quality scans. In terms of the Pri Ets Haim Chadash, I mean, I do have a job as a prof, and so that I that keeps me busy most of the time, all of the time. But the Pri Ets Haim Chadash has always been a pet project, and where do we take it? So I published an article which gives online access, and I'll include that in for students want to go to, so you can access just the 95% of the tshuvot that were written that are part of this collection, Pri Ets Haim Chadash, online. Some of them are more legible than others. Some of them are even typed in late reason. My grandfather's tshuva, just to finish off with what I said at the beginning, turns out that in order for him to be hired, in order for the government to give an exemption, he had to go through an examination process. So he had to have the formal government appointed rabbinical college of examiners examine him over a few days in a very structured way. He had to write a tshuva, which again was one of those tshuvas that you were looking for a kula, and it's very hard to find. And as I was reading the answers, he had more and more trouble finding a kula until he finally found one that he felt comfortable with. But so I'm looking for ways of maybe to digitize the handwritten, start working on that, and see how far we get. But having the two articles, one on the Ets Haim and one on the Ets Haim Chadash, that's pretty well sort of completes my work in this area. We'll see where it goes.
Okay.
Thank you very much, by the way.
You're welcome. Thank you for coming on, and thank you, really, David Sklar, for connecting us, and thank you. I'm glad we were able to get this done, and I'll share those articles as well. If you have them, we can share them. The WhatsApp chat is very easy to share PDFs. Anyone not on the WhatsApp community, you should join. It's admin only. I post, Sfarim books and such things. Otherwise, if there's a link to them, I'll put the link in the podcast show's notes as well that listeners can access and they can look at. But really, this is a fascinating topic. And like I said, it's not well known. It's a community that unfortunately isn't so well known. And there's a lot here, a lot of really interesting, fascinating material. And with Josh and Dicta, I think there's really a lot of potential there. It's really a very cool project and something that's very unique and interesting. And I'm sure our listeners will want to learn more about that as well. And so thank you both for joining me. I appreciate it.
One thing that Josh did not mention is while we met with him in Israel, we put Max Menkel Hirsch's indexing system against Dicta's indexing system, and he found the Suadaka tshuva was not in the Menko index, and the AI discovered it. So I just wanted to make sure that we mentioned that.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. Yeah, and thank you, Nachi, very much for hosting us, and I love your podcast. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And listen, that, Daniel, what you said, that's something that happens, Josh was saying the shortcomings still with the OCR and the AI technology and computer technology. Of course, there are always going to be shortcomings. But on the other hand, there's shortcomings with manual work as well. And so there you really see that, the shortcomings to both. And I'm sure as you guys have worked through the technology digitization process, I'm sure you've seen many issues with the Dicta, technology as well. And so you get to see the both, which is really interesting. So thank you both for joining me. And there'll be links and information in the show's notes below and in the WhatsApp community. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Nachi.
Bye-bye. Thank you.